let me just mention at the beginning, and I'll mention at the end, next week, we're going to need to move a little bit because the time of Mincha is getting earlier. So we are moving to 5:30 p.m. in Israel, 10:30 a.m. in New York or the East Coast. And you can figure out the times and all the other locations you may be in. So that's 1/2 hour earlier next week. Okay, this week we are discussing Parshat Tetze. Now you would think that we'd have plenty to talk about in Parshat Tetze because it has the most mitzvot of any parsha in the Torah, 41. Wow. 41 in Gematria is aim, as in mother. This is the mother of all parshiot when it comes to the number of mitzvot. But I want to try to find a common theme that connects most of the mitzvot, perhaps not all of them, but I think most of them. And you know where we look when we want to get an indication of the inclination of the parsha. We always look at the name of the parsha, Tetze. I want to suggest that Tetze, which is part of this first mitzvah of going out to war, but in a general sense, Tetze, when you go out, that means when you go out to the world at large, then you're going to, Charlotte is telling me about 74. There's a difference of opinion as to how many mitzvot there are. The Rebbe says there are 41. We won't debate that now, and others say even more, 74. Yes, that is another opinion. Some of them are divided into two. But whatever that may be, it's the most of any parsha. And Tetze, when you go out, so I want to suggest when you go out to the world and you go into society, one of the things that happen, especially if you, let's say, have been a good boy or girl and you've been sitting and studying Torah all day long and into the night, now it's time to actually go out into that brave new world. And what happens is you're going to be exposed to all kinds of temptations that society has to offer. And those temptations are going to test your character and going to determine what have you learned and what kind of moral being are you that you can react almost instinctively to different situations. And much of that is holding back on what you might perhaps be urged to do at first glance. And that's what much of the Torah is about. You may remember I think we spoke way back when we talked about Pesach and matzah and why matzah is so significant to Pesach. I mean, a lot of amazing things happened on Pesach. It wasn't just about matzah, and yet matzah seems to be the representation of this first and maybe most important Chag, and that's why we call it Chag HaMatzot. And part of the idea, one of the ideas we expressed, was that matzah represents holding back. It represents not giving in completely to temptation, to make that dough into a fluffy, delicious lachmaniyah or whatever it may be, but to hold back, to stop the process, stop the presses, and what you're left with is matzah. And I want to suggest that much of the Torah is about controlling our passions and especially controlling temptation and, in a sense, letting our passions get the best of us. Rashi brings in this very first mitzvah, which we'll talk about in a second, about Yifat Toar, Rashi brings this phrase from Kiddushin that is very dramatic and not so simple to understand. The Gemara says, Lo dibra Torah, ela keneged yetzer hara. The Torah is all about, and I think we can paraphrase and translate it that way. The Torah is all about controlling your yetzer. Yetzer hara, in some cases, it's even yetzer hatov. In other words, controlling temptation. And I want to suggest that that is the common denominator that is stringing together these mitzvot, be they 40, 70, etc. I want to take a look at 7 or 8 of them just to give you an example of that. The Torah is one huge attempt through its mitzvot and halachot and dinim to control the temptations and passions of a normal human being, sometimes denying them altogether, but more often channeling them in a way that releases rather than rejects them altogether. Not a simple thing to do. So we start with the Yifat To'ar. This is a beautiful woman who is captured in war. Rashi says it's a milchemet reshut. It's not a milchemet mitzvah. In this week's Parsha Shiur, I talked about the differences between the wars. And obligatory war would actually call to basically wipe out the nations or cause them all to flee. But an optional war could result in capturing, taking prisoners. And in this case, talking about a soldier who doesn't necessarily have to be a soldier, but pretty much that's what it would amount to be, who captures one of these foreign women. Rashi says could even be a Kanani, even though we regard that nationality as being a very, having very negative moral character. But this is a beautiful woman. And now the Torah has to make a decision. Do we allow the soldier to give in to his temptations, his sexual proclivities? Or do we say to him, no, you have to deny it completely? So the Torah finds a compromise and says, well, technically you shouldn't marry her at all, but in order to deal with your temptation, in Hebrew, pitui, so there are a couple of things you can do. Number one, you can wait a month. And during that time, we give this woman the opportunity to mourn, either for her nation or if her family was killed in war, which may result in her becoming less attractive than she was before. And indeed, the Torah talks about all the different things that she would have to do, that if she's dressed seductively, she's going to have to change those clothes. She's going to, and you can see these first psukim, that she has to shave her head, she has to let her nails grow. That may not sound so bad today, but essentially, these are things which are going to make her less attractive in the hopes that this Jew, soldier or not, who sees her and desires her, will lose some of that attraction for her. There's an opinion that says they can have relations once, and then they go through this same process, and then they marry. So it's not that they are having this one-time fling. They basically have to get married, even though, as Rashi brings out, the results will probably not be good. And therefore, Rashi connects the first 3 items and scenarios in our Parsha together, that he sees this woman, he desires this woman that he really shouldn't have. Nevertheless, under certain circumstances, he's allowed to take her, but it may very well produce problematic children and lead to, we see later, the issue of divorce, and also even this rebellious child, which we'll talk about a little bit afterwards. So the Torah is saying we don't want to completely deny him this great passion and desire he has, but we're going to channel it in a way that will filter it and maybe moderate it. In fact, one of the opinions is just knowing that he has to wait a month, he may say, okay, well, if I know I can have her in a month, I'm not all that attracted to her. We always want what we can't have. So this is how the Parsha begins, with this very strange story of the Yafat Toar that sounds to be very anti-Torah. In other words, you marry a nice Jewish girl. She knows how to make gefilte fish and chicken soup, etc. And she comes from a good background. She's intelligent. She'll tell you what to do. But instead, the Torah is telling us that if you really get this passion for someone that you really is not somebody that you're cut out for, we don't say to reject it altogether out of hand, but to approach it and channel it in a way that maybe we can get you past it. The whole issue of war, which this is the context of Yafat Toar, this is also something which is very tempting. When you're in war, you basically have the mindset that I can go wild. I can do whatever I want to do. I can rob and pillage. And indeed, many armies are like that, that the soldiers are told, if you conquer this country, do whatever you want, take the property, kill the people, rape the women, and let your passions go wild. But the Torah, of course, has a very different approach to war. And it has what we call, even today, Tohar Haneshek, purity of arms. You may have seen this on the news yesterday when Benny Gantz and also Yair Lapid, in reaction to the United States saying, we may want to advise you on the rules of engagement. And both of them said, listen, there is no more moral army than the Israeli army. And therefore, nobody has to teach us about Tohar HaNeshek, that we understand exactly what is permissible and what is not in war. And we're very careful about how our soldiers conduct themselves. And we know that we have an extreme, by far the most moral army, maybe in history, but certainly in the world today. And we do not do any of the abuses that other armies do. And the Torah is filled with all kinds of laws. In this week's Parsha, we're told about the fact that you cannot have a spiritually impure soldier. He has to go out of the camp. We were told last time you have to leave an escape route for the enemy. You don't cut down, generally, don't cut down and destroy fruit trees, and even bathroom etiquette, that when you have to go to the bathroom, this week's Parsha tells you there's a way to do it that is proper. And you even have a special tool that the soldier carries, a kind of small shovel, in order to take care of his business and do it outside of the general camp. And because, and the Torah puts it very beautifully in terms of the general principle, the Torah says, Ki Hashem Elokecha mitalech bekerev machanecha, that Hashem, your God, he walks in the midst of your camp, your army base, or your camp in the field, latzilcha, to save you, v'latet oivecha lefanecha, and to deliver your enemy before you, vayam achanecha kodesh, but your camp has to be holy, v'lo yerba ervat davar v'shav me'acharecha, and therefore God shall never see you commit any shameful act such that he would turn away from you. So there too, you see, in war, there are great temptations. Do anything you want, go wild. The Torah tells you no. Now we do, as our very last mitzvah in the Torah, have, you might say, the exception that proves the rule. There is a time when you really can go full out, and that's against Amalek. Amalek is the nation that is really the anti-God nation, and there you can wipe them out completely. Even there, by the way, there are certain restrictions, but essentially that is an indication that in all other cases, you have to conduct yourself as a moral and holy person. And that means controlling your passions. When dealing with unruly children, here too, the Torah tells us you might have this temptation to disenfranchise some of your children. You might want to play favorites, and you might want to do something that the Torah feels is not in the character of a good parent. So the Torah tells you, be very careful. In this case, you want to disenfranchise your firstborn because this is a case of a man that has two wives. Thank God we don't have to deal with that situation anymore for the last 1,000+ years. But if you have two wives and you come to dislike one and she delivers your first child, you might be tempted, you know what? Either because the child is not deserving in your eyes or because you want to get back at that wife that you don't like. And so you say, you know what? I'll make sure that my other children, they get the larger inheritance. And the Torah says, no, you can't do it. It says, Lo yuchal levaker et ben ha'uva al pnei ben hasnuah ha'bachor. You can't reject the firstborn who came from this hated wife in favor of a later born child from the wife that you quote unquote love. What's going on here really, what's interesting that the Mefarshim say is this is talking about us. This is talking about the Jewish people. We are called the Bechor of God. We are God's firstborn child. And basically the Torah is saying, in a sense to God, that even when we misbehave, God, you cannot fail to recognize who we are. It's an interesting word, this verb, levaker. It can come from the word bechor. You can't, it's the only time the Torah uses this word. It can mean, just like we turn certain words into verbs, like SMS, le sames, somebody. So here we're saying you can't make the non-firstborn into a firstborn, but some say it comes from the word lahakir, to recognize. That you have to recognize and do justice to the child who deserves it by law. And in a sense, we're saying to Hashem, when we, the children of Israel, misbehave, remember, God, we're still your firstborn. So you can't simply disenfranchise us, even if you want to. That's the halacha. Then we come to the issue of hashavat aveda. This is a beautiful idea of returning a lost article. And you know, there's an entire Gemara about it and all kinds of discussion about the laws and the give and take of returning a lost article. Here too, we have a temptation. We find something and we want to keep it. It's lying on the street. There's nobody around. Let's take it. But the Torah tells us, no, you cannot simply take it under all circumstances. Hashev to shiveim. It uses this double phraseology to say, yes, you want to take it, but you must surely return it, even when your temptation and your instincts and your passion says, I want to keep that. It's a very fascinating halacha. And the, I think, principle behind it is that essentially God gives us everything we need. We don't need to have somebody else's property. That wasn't meant for us. If they lost it, then do a chesed. Help this fellow Jew. Doesn't have to be a Jew, but essentially the law is given between Jews. Go and find the owner, no matter how long it takes. Do you know how long you have to keep an article that has a siman, that has a recognizable sign? How long do you have to keep that till the owner comes? The answer is forever. You have to take care of it, and in the hope that someday the owner may come back. And the idea behind it is that God gives you everything you need. You don't have to take somebody else's. You know, we learn a lot of things that Gemara tells us from the animal kingdom and from the creatures around us. And the Gemara says one of the things we learn from an ant is that if an ant touches a crumb and then goes away and another ant comes, it will never take the crumb that another ant had taken first. It's very fascinating, and it's true. It's something that the rabbis observed, and they will just ignore it because they're saying it's not ours. I remember very distinctly when I was quite young. I was walking with a cousin of mine, Zichrono Livracha, and we saw a $5 bill on the sidewalk. And so I went to pick it up. I did pick it up. And I said to him, let's split it. He said, I don't want it. I said, why not? He said, I didn't work for it. You're welcome to keep it. You're a kid. I don't expect you to give it up, but I don't need anything that I don't work for and earn for myself. And it was, I still remember it to this day. And that's basically the idea, that we don't need to necessarily, there's no harm. Money is something that essentially does not have a siman. It does not have a recognizable sign to it, unless it was found put in a clearly a certain place or in a certain way. I always say that to people, if I find money, if you can tell me the serial number, I'll probably give it back to you. That's pretty remarkable. That's a good sign. If not, you can keep the money. But the principle is, you don't need something necessarily that really belongs to somebody else. We have here in this Parsha laws about marriage and divorce. And one of the issues there, we talk about the fact that Judaism accepts and realizes the reality that sometimes marriages don't work and therefore divorce is necessary. That's probably the whole idea of the ketubah. The ketubah may be sending a message that you're making a commitment. And yes, there is a possibility that the marriage may not work out, and then you're going to have to deal with it, and you're going to have to fight any temptation you may have to punish your spouse, to deny your spouse. The ketubah says, no, you're going to have responsibility for somebody that you don't want to be with anymore. And that was a revolutionary concept back in biblical days, or even post-biblical days, that husbands had this responsibility to their wives right from the get-go. And we're also given this interesting law that says you cannot remarry your wife if she married somebody else after your divorce. This, of course, is true for a Kohen, but it's true for anybody. It's true for a Kohen even if she didn't marry anyone else. But the whole idea was to eliminate what we would call Hollywood-style marriages. That is, you just keep marrying and divorcing and marrying and often remarrying. I think Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton did that. And I don't know if that was with another marriage in between, but if it was, we'd have to tell Elizabeth Taylor, a nice Jewish girl, that's not really something the Torah allows. But the whole idea is to control the passions so that you're not jumping from one wife to another. And this is echoed in a lot of different laws that deal with marriage. We have relationships with non-Jews. You might have this temptation to reject all non-Jews and treat all of them negatively, but the Torah tells us, no, you can't do that. You have to control those passions, because there are differences. There are some here the Torah points out the differences between Ammon and Moab, that they would be rejected. They're not going to be accepted within the Jewish community, primarily because they have this strain of cruelty, which we say cannot be part of the Jewish DNA. That's why Abraham will send Eliezer a long way away to find a bride for Yitzchak, but not from among the people that he and Sarah, his wife, converted, because he was really looking for somebody who came from his own family or a branch of the family, because they had this DNA of chesed, which is what Rivka is all about. And that's something that Abraham says is very, very hard to teach. Ammon and Moab absolutely did not have it, but Edom and Egypt, under certain circumstances, they can join the Jewish people, and you can marry those who convert from those nations, because Edom is family. Edom comes from Esav, who is obviously a member of the royal family as well, Yaakov's twin brother, and Mitzrayim, because they expressed and showed chesed when they took us in initially in Egypt, although it did not turn out so well. There's always a tremendous temptation when it comes to money, and the Torah understands that, and people are very passionate about money. But the Torah tells us, yeah, you're tempted to gather as much as you possibly can and keep it all, but you can't do that. You have to conquer your temptation, and you have to know that it's not the end all and be all of life. You can't work on 7 days a week. You have to take off on Shabbat and Chagim, even though it might cost you money. You have to lend money. It's a mitzvah in kesef tilveh, if meaning when you will lend money, and you can't charge interest. Yes, we have all kinds of loopholes. We have the heter iska that allows you to take interest from banks because you become, in a sense, a partner. And then we have the Prose Bowl, which Prose Bowl is not a famous football game, by the way. The Prose Bowl is a document that's played in Pasadena. Now, this is a document that allows you to transfer debts to a Beit Din when you approach the Shemitah year, as we're doing this year, in the Shemitah year, that otherwise people would not ever lend money if they knew they were not going to get it back at the end of the Shemitah year without going into that. We have free loan societies where people understand you may not get paid back at all. We're told in this week's Parsha, you can't go into somebody's house if they gave you a collateral and collect certain things. You can't take their clothes, you can't take their sheets or mattresses that they need to sleep on. The Torah tells us there too, and just to take a quick look at that pasuk in Chaf Daled Yud Gimel, the Torah says, Hashev tashiv lo et ha'avot kavo hashemesh, when the sun goes down and they need something to sleep with, give it to them, b'shacha b'salmato uverachecha, and then they will bless you. They will see you are a person of morals and chesed. Ulecha tiyeh tzedakah lifnei Hashem elokecha. And then that will be an act of tzedek in front of God. So you practice that kind of generosity towards others, and God will give it back to you, essentially. Sometimes we can't control our emotions, and we are tempted to say things we know that we shouldn't say, and we blurt out, and it may be with a curse, it may be with a promise. And the Torah tells us, be careful. Avoid the temptation of saying just anything at any time, because you might pay for it. Because if you take a vow, you very well have to fulfill it. We're going to have Hatarat Nidarim, which is another kind of loophole to get out of it. But the Torah tells us in the pasuk, let me read it to you. The Torah says, Ki tidor neder l'Hashem lo ta'acher l'shalmo. You must pay it. Ki doroshid reshenu Hashem elokecha meimach. Again, the double phraseology. God will definitely require it from you, and if you don't live up to your promise, vayabachachet, you're going to be doing a sin. You're on the job, and there's food all around. You're tempted to eat it. You say, listen, I work here. Why can't I eat it? The Torah says you can, but there are limits as to how much you're allowed to eat. So the Torah tells us, it's a very fascinating law. If you're working in the field, in a vineyard, eat as many grapes as you want. Go for it. But don't pack it up into your backpack. That's a no-no. The same thing when you go into a field that, let's say it's where corn is growing. Yeah, take some corn. That's okay. You deserve it. But you know what? Again, don't chop down all the grain or all the corn that's there and pack it up in a suitcase. No, there are limits. Yes, we don't want to stop you completely with all of these laws. That's the common denominator. You have that passion, you have that temptation. Okay, to some extent, it can play out. You can do it, but there has to be a control factor. The same thing with money, the same thing with talking. The Torah tells you, how do you avoid making a bad vow? Just shut up. Don't talk so much. And probably you'll avoid saying something that you'll regret later. In all of these situations, we're not really saying you can't do it at all. You find something on the ground that was lost. Again, maybe you can keep it. It depends. Maybe you can't. It's not going to be something where you let your temptations rule and do whatever you feel like doing. There has to be control. The Torah is teaching us, control yourself. Yes, we want you to have passion. It's good to have temptations. The Gemara says when they managed to eradicate the Yetzer Hara, they couldn't find an egg in all of Israel. It wasn't a good thing. Yetzer Hara sometimes helps us. What would a marriage be without passion? What would a job be without passion? What would a world be if you don't have this very strong impulse to do things? It's not boring. It would be very boring if you didn't have it, but control it. We talk about as well, just to wrap up, you might be tempted to take advantage of the most vulnerable people in society, the orphans, the widows. They don't have protexia generally, but the Torah says no. Even though you're tempted to take advantage of these people, they might be easy pickings. Sorry, Hashem says, I will guard them myself. And if you steal from them, if you mistreat them, if you take advantage of their situation, then you will pay for it. So again, control, telling us that passion is good, but it has to be channeled in the right direction. And finally, this phrase that we say in Shema, Lo tatur acharei levavachem b'acharei einechem. These are the two instruments or vehicles of temptation. Something that you just get this thrill in your heart. I've got to have it. It starts with einechem, when you see it. That's what you've got to control. Control how deeply you focus on something you shouldn't have, and then let your passions, which are always indicated by the heart sign, levavachem, don't let that carry you too far. You've got to have heart, and you've got to have this will and a strong sense of desire, but you can never let it carry you too far. That's what the Rashi meant when he said, Lo dibra Torah ela keneged Yetzer Hara. That's all the Torah. Almost everything that's in there is trying to take that great passion and energy you have, but channel it in the right direction. So these 41 or 74 psukim, I suggest that's what ties almost all of them together and makes it really a very fascinating set, all in one parsha alone. And that's Parsha Tetze. When you go out the door and you go into society, you can have the passion, but somehow you have to learn to control it. So I'm done. If anybody wants to make a quick comment and our host allows it, you can. If not, I will thank you all and remind you 5:30 next week instead of 6 p.m. Anybody want to comment? If not, then I wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom and look forward to seeing you next time.
Shabbat
Thank
Shalom.
you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.